At my granddaughter's wedding, they seated me behind a marble column, hidden, forgotten. I paid for every flower, every chandelier, every glass of champagne. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply walked away before the toasts. That night, I canceled everything. The food, the music, even the flowers. Their dream collapsed. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The golden lights of the Fairmont Hotel's ballroom shimmered across crystal chandeliers, bathing the celebration in radiance. Laughter rose like music. Clinking glasses marked every toast, and cameras flashed to capture what was meant to be remembered forever. Yet Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who had funded this opulence, sat invisible. Her place card had been placed at a small round table, hidden behind a marble column, a vantage point from which she could only glimpse fragments of her granddaughter's joy. She could hear the orchestra, could feel the bass reverberate in her chest, but she was meant to remain unseen. She smoothed the silk of her navy dress, her hands steady despite the sting of humiliation. She had paid for the music, the flowers, the champagne, yet her presence was tucked away like a shameful secret. It was no accident. Eleanor's sharp mind, once celebrated at Harvard, where she trained generations of diplomats and negotiators, recognized design when she saw it. Her family wanted her silenced, diminished, out of sight. She forced a smile, though her eyes burned, and withdrew quietly before the first course was served. Later that night, as the celebration carried on without her, Eleanor canceled the payment for the event with the same calm precision she had once used to finalize million-dollar contracts. She did not slam the phone, did not allow herself the indulgence of fury. Her revenge, if it came, would not be loud. It would be exacting. The following afternoon, back in her Beacon Hill home, she carried a silver tray of teacups into the kitchen. The spring breeze swept in through the open window, carrying the sound of voices. Bright, cheerful, careless voices. Catherine, her daughter, stood on the veranda with Victoria, her granddaughter. "So we'll need to clear out most of the old things," Catherine said, her tone brisk, decisive. "The room is outdated, badly in need of work." "Do you think she'll resist?" Victoria asked, her voice lowering into a conspiratorial murmur. Eleanor paused, tray balanced in her hands. For a fleeting second, she hoped they were finally planning that long-promised family trip she had suggested months ago, a journey to draw them closer before her upcoming 80th birthday. Her heart warmed briefly at the possibility, but Catherine's words stole the hope as quickly as it appeared. "Mom barely notices changes anymore. We'll be doing her a favor. That guest room looks like the 1980s swallowed it whole." The teacups rattled against their saucers as Eleanor set them down more forcefully than she intended. Not a trip, not a gesture of togetherness. They were already discussing how to alter her home, how to erase her choices, her history, as though her presence no longer mattered. That evening in the dining room, the one that had hosted senators and diplomats during her late husband's career, Victoria lifted her glass for attention. "Grandma, we've been thinking about your guest bedroom. It needs a complete overhaul for when we need to take over the house." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, her decades of negotiation training carrying her through. "Oh?" she asked mildly. "It's just practical," Catherine added quickly, smiling as if discussing the weather instead of her mother's eventual decline. Drew Pearson, Victoria's fiancé, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm sure that's a long way off. Mrs. Whitmore is only 78. 78 isn't young," Catherine replied smoothly. The remark landed like a stone in Eleanor's chest. She allowed the conversation to drift on, but her mind was elsewhere. Later, alone in her study, she let her fingers travel across the framed achievements that lined the shelves. Awards for her years at Harvard, photographs beside world leaders, letters from presidents thanking her for her wisdom. Catherine had once suggested she simplify this room, calling the memories clutter. Eleanor's gaze lingered on a particular letter, written in a president's steady hand, praising her extraordinary ability to anticipate moves before they happened. Where had that woman gone? At dinner the next evening, Eleanor attempted to tell her family a story about her late husband. "Your grandfather always said the Whitmore name opened doors, but it was character that kept them open." "Does anyone want more wine?" Catherine interrupted brightly, cutting her mother off mid-sentence. Victoria glanced at her watch. It's getting late, Grandma. Only Drew seemed interested, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. Please continue, Mrs. Whitmore. I'd love to hear about the judge. The words caught Eleanor's breath. She thanked him softly, even as Victoria's eyes narrowed at his encouragement. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor descended the staircase for tea. Voices drifted from her study, the door left slightly ajar. Yes, she's getting more fragile, Catherine's voice said, low but distinct. But her mind is good enough to sign papers. We need to accelerate before her 80th birthday. The teacup nearly slipped from Eleanor's grasp. The birthday, just 14 months away, marked the transfer of the Whitmore family trust, the cornerstone of a legacy built over generations. Her heart did not pound from fear. It pulsed with anger, sharp and clarifying. They were not waiting for her decline. They were orchestrating it. Quietly, she returned to her room and opened the drawer of her nightstand. Inside lay her husband's silver pocket watch, carried through countless trials during his years as a judge. He had always said it revealed the moment when truth emerged in his courtroom. She closed her hand around the cool silver, and something long dormant stirred within her. They thought her faded. They thought her a frail woman, irrelevant, pliable. They had forgotten who Eleanor Whitmore really was. That would be their first mistake. Dinner the following evening unfolded with all the polish of a family accustomed to appearances. The mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier's light, china glistened, and silver cutlery reflected tiny bursts of brilliance. Eleanor Whitmore took her usual place at the head of the table, her back straight, her smile measured. To any outsider, it was a scene of warmth. To her, it was another act in a carefully staged play where she had been written as a supporting character in her own home. She tried once again to bridge the distance with memory. Your grandfather used to say the Whitmore name might open a door, but only character could keep it open. Her voice carried the resonance of someone who had stood before lecture halls filled with ambitious students. For a brief moment, silence hung, and Eleanor thought she had pierced through the clamor. But Catherine broke in with an easy smile, lifting the wine bottle. Does anyone want more Cabernet? She poured without waiting for an answer, drowning her mother's words in the rich crimson swirl. Eleanor swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. She tried again, turning toward her granddaughter. Victoria, did I ever tell you about your grandfather's first judicial appointment? It changed the way— Grandma, Victoria interrupted, flicking her eyes to her watch with practiced subtlety. It's getting late. Eleanor's lips curved into a polite smile, though it didn't touch her eyes. Only Drew, sitting across from her, leaned forward with genuine interest. Please, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice steady. I'd love to hear about Judge Whitmore. The sincerity in his tone startled her, a crack of light in a room gone dim. She offered him a quiet thank you, careful to keep her gratitude concealed from Catherine and Victoria, who exchanged a look sharp enough to slice porcelain. Eleanor noted it, tucking the observation away as neatly as one of her old case notes. That night, sleep eluded her. She wandered down the shadowed hallway, her hand gliding across the polished banister worn smooth by generations. The house whispered with memories, each corner carrying echoes of a life built brick by brick with her late husband. She reached the study and froze. The door, left slightly ajar, allowed voices to slip through like threads of betrayal. Yes, she's getting more fragile, Catherine murmured, her voice calculated and cold. But her mind is still clear enough to sign papers. We need to accelerate before her 80th birthday. Eleanor's breath caught. The porcelain teacup she carried tilted dangerously in her hand, hot liquid threatening to spill. She steadied it, her grip turning iron. 14 months, that was all that remained until the trust transferred. The Whitmore legacy, stewarded for decades, ready to pass to the next guardian. Her daughter and granddaughter were not waiting for her decline. They were planning for it, manipulating the milestones of her life as though she were a pawn on their board. She remained utterly still in the hallway, her heart hammering not with fear but with clarity. Anger, sharp and cleansing, surged through her veins. The years she had spent teaching negotiation at Harvard had not faded into dust. The strategist within her had not vanished. She had only been lulled into silence by the soft weight of family bonds. Not anymore. She returned to her room with deliberate steps and opened the drawer of her nightstand. Inside, wrapped in faded velvet, lay the silver pocket watch of her late husband. Judge George Whitmore had carried it through decades of trials, claiming it helped him recognize the instant when truth revealed itself. Eleanor lifted it gently, the metal cool against her palm. The tick of its mechanism filled the silence, steady, unrelenting. She closed her fingers around it, and something within her stirred awake, something that had lain dormant too long. She was no fragile widow, no faded relic to be humored and dismissed. She was Eleanor Whitmore, strategist, professor, negotiator, the woman world leaders had once sought for counsel, the woman her family had underestimated. The pocket watch glinted in the lamplight as she whispered into the darkness, her voice low and resolute. "They've forgotten who I am." It was not a lament. It was a vow. Days later, Victoria's engagement to Drew was announced amid champagne toasts and clinking glasses in Eleanor's own parlor. The young woman's smile was bright, her voice honeyed with charm as she leaned in for Eleanor's blessing. She cooed about venues, about the grandeur she deserved, about traditions she intended to claim. Her gaze lingered not on Eleanor's face but on the sapphire brooch pinned to her shoulder, a Whitmore heirloom worn by generations of brides. "Grandma, you look radiant tonight," Victoria said, kissing her cheek with theatrical affection. "That brooch, it's tradition, isn't it? The bride wears it?" "Yes, dear," Eleanor answered softly, her fingertips brushing the jewel. "It will be yours to wear on your wedding day." The sparkle in Victoria's eyes was not gratitude. It was calculation, sharp and acquisitive. Eleanor smiled anyway. The pocket watch in her handbag pressed against her palm, its weight both comfort and reminder. She had once been respected. She had once been formidable. And she would be again. That evening, after the guests had gone, she stood before her mirror. The reflection staring back was not the docile grandmother her family imagined. Her shoulders straightened, her eyes sharpened, her lips curved in something that looked dangerously close to triumph. "They've made their first mistake," she whispered. And with that, the strategists began to plan. They thought she was fading. They thought the years had softened her mind and dulled her instincts. But Eleanor Whitmore had not forgotten who she was. They had underestimated her, and in doing so had awakened a strategist more dangerous in silence than she had ever been in command. The days following Victoria's engagement unfolded like a rehearsal of deceit. Sweet smiles and honeyed words masked sharp intentions. Victoria came to Eleanor's fund with syrupy affection, always when she needed something. The Fairmont Hotel, she explained, had always been her dream venue. She spoke of chandeliers and champagne fountains, her voice trembling at the mention of costs she pretended were too great to bear. Her hand rested gently on Eleanor's wrist, as if affection could excuse the obvious manipulation. "I only want to honor the Whitmore legacy," Victoria whispered, eyes glistening with well-practiced tears. "A wedding worthy of our family name." The words might have moved another woman. But Eleanor had taught young diplomats how to recognize rehearsed speeches. She saw the calculation in her granddaughter's gaze, the same calculation that had followed the diamond brooch across Eleanor's shoulder weeks before. "Of course," Eleanor said, her smile warm but empty. "The venue, the flowers, the music, even the honeymoon. Consider it my gift." Victoria embraced her with theatrical gratitude. Catherine beamed with pride. Drew shifted uncomfortably, sensing something wrong but unsure of how to voice it. Eleanor, ever the patient strategist, accepted their charade with grace, storing away every glance, every tone, every gesture like evidence. Later that evening, as she passed by the hallway, she overheard Drew's low voice. "Don't you think we're taking advantage?" Victoria's laugh was light, dismissive. "Grandma loves feeling needed. She's showing signs of decline anyway. We're just protecting her from herself." Decline. Eleanor's jaw clenched, her steps frozen. She had never received such a diagnosis, never once heard a physician suggest she was slipping. The lie was deliberate, designed to reduce her authority, to render her powerless before her own legacy was stripped away. When they left, Catherine called with a tone that tried to mask unease. "Victoria may have gone too far, but she's set on this dream wedding, Mother. You seemed happy to help." "I am," Eleanor answered lightly, her fingers curling around the small recording device hidden in her drawer. "Very happy to help." She sat at her desk long into the night, calculator in hand, charting the costs of the wedding against the balances of her accounts. Their requests were not mere extravagance. They were strategically designed to drain her resources before her 80th birthday, when the family trust would transfer. It was not thoughtless greed. It was calculated sabotage. The realization did not crush her. It steadied her. From a velvet-lined box, she withdrew documents long hidden. Investments she and George had built decades earlier, accounts untouched, growing quietly while she played the role of widow, the role of grandmother. They had forgotten she was also a strategist. She lifted the recorder and pressed the red button. "Begin recording," she said clearly. "Project Restoration, Day 1. Her voice startled her. It no longer sounded fragile. It rang with clarity, with authority. It sounded like Eleanor Whitmore again. Rain tapped against the window as she outlined her strategy. She mapped contingencies, identified vulnerabilities, listed allies. Each stroke of the pen tightened her resolve. By dawn, she had drafted a plan worthy of the woman who had once guided senators and presidents. She had 14 months until her birthday, but she would not need that long. The Whitmore legacy had never been about wealth alone. It was resilience, it was strategy, it was justice. And justice, delayed though it might be, would come. 3 months before the wedding, she arrived unannounced at Catherine's house. The sapphire brooch nestled in her purse. She had foolishly hoped it might still hold symbolic weight. Voices floated from the kitchen, laughter, careless and cruel. "It's exhausting to hear her ramble about Dad's cases," Catherine said. "At least you can leave after dinner." She kept asking questions about accessibility during the venue tour, Victoria replied, her tone mocking. "So embarrassing. The planner probably thinks she's senile." Laughter followed, sharp as glass. Rebecca's voice, no, Victoria's voice, lowered, conspiratorial. "After the wedding, we can stop pretending. I've been practicing my sad face for when we talk about memory care options." "We just need to maintain appearances until the will is secure," Catherine answered. Eleanor's hand slipped into her pocket, pressing the button on her recorder. Every word, every insult captured. Her heart did not race. Her fingers did not tremble. She had taught students that emotion was weakness in negotiation. Knowledge was power. And now she had both. Later that night, she sat in her study, the brooch before her, the pocket watch gleaming in the lamplight. 5 generations of Whitmore brides had worn the brooch. 5 generations of Whitmore men had carried the watch. They were not merely ornaments. They were reminders of strength, of time, of truth revealed. For years, she had diminished herself, allowing interruptions, insults, dismissals. No more. She reached for the phone, dialing a number long untouched. "Charlotte, who is saying, she said when her friend answered, her voice firm. "It's Eleanor Whitmore. I believe I may need some legal advice." The weight of the pocket watch no longer felt like memory. It felt like a countdown. They thought her a relic. They were about to learn how dangerous a strategist could be when underestimated. And if you've ever watched someone dismissed, only to rise with quiet power, stay with me. You won't believe what Eleanor does next. The morning air carried the scent of spring rain as Eleanor Whitmore stepped into a waiting cab, her handbag resting lightly against her side. Inside it, the pocket watch ticked with the steadiness of a drumbeat. She had made her decision. No more silence, no more indulgent smiles that disguised humiliation. It was time to prepare. Her first appointment was at the office of Richard Lawson, the family's long-trusted attorney. The leather chairs, the dark oak shelves filled with law books, the faint scent of tobacco lingering from another era, all of it spoke of tradition and reliability. Richard rose as she entered, his expression warm but touched with curiosity. "Eleanor," he greeted, offering his hand, "you're looking well." "Appearances," she said with a faint smile, "can be deceiving." She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her posture commanding as it had once been at faculty meetings in Cambridge. "I need your help." For the next hour, she detailed everything she had overheard, every manipulation, every plan whispered when they thought she slept. Richard's pen moved swiftly, his brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. "What you describe," he said carefully, "could be considered elder exploitation at minimum, financial abuse, possibly more. I'm not interested in a courtroom battle against my daughter and granddaughter, Eleanor replied, her voice calm but edged with iron. I want protection and accountability. Together they reviewed her will, the trust, and every power of attorney Catherine had conveniently secured over the years. By noon, Eleanor had revoked access, establishing safeguards nearly impossible to contest. Richard assured her the changes were airtight. The cognitive assessment will add another layer of protection, he said. But Eleanor, you should know, when they realize what you've done, the fallout will be severe. She signed the final document with a steady hand. I'm counting on it. That afternoon, she visited the office of Dr. Alan Mercer, her physician of 3 decades. His kind eyes studied her as he ushered her in. Margaret, no, forgive me, Eleanor, he corrected himself with a smile. It's good to see you. What brings you in today? I need a full cognitive evaluation, she said plainly. His smile faded into professional concern. Are you experiencing symptoms? No symptoms, only family members who find it convenient to suggest otherwise. Silence hung between them for a long moment before Dr. Mercer sighed. Unfortunately, I see this more often than you'd think. Let's do the tests. Hours later, his verdict was clear and documented. Eleanor Whitmore was entirely intact, no signs of decline. A medical report now stood between her and the lies whispered behind closed doors. She returned home lighter than she had in months, her handbag filled not with receipts or prescriptions, but with weapons, legal documents, medical proof, and the unshakable clarity of a woman who had reclaimed control. The following week, she sat across from the bank manager in a polished office overlooking Boston's skyline. I want to restructure my accounts, she said. Immediate deposits to the wedding vendors, but final payments scheduled for the day of the event itself, with full cancellation rights up to 24 hours before. The manager blinked. That's highly unusual, Mrs. Whitmore. Unusual, she agreed, but not illegal. Her eyes held his steadily until he nodded. Every vendor contract was rewritten, every deposit carefully managed. The facade of generosity remained intact. Catherine and Victoria would see only her compliance. But beneath the surface, the foundation of their scheme began to crack. That evening, the wedding planner arrived at her home, a stack of contracts in hand. She read them carefully, her pen poised. These arrangements are unconventional, the planner said delicately. They are binding, Eleanor corrected, her voice pleasant but firm. Final payments on the day of the event. Automatic, unless canceled. The woman hesitated, then nodded. As you wish, Mrs. Whitmore. When the door closed, Eleanor carried the papers to her study, laying them neatly beside the pocket watch. Her desk, once cluttered with photographs and mementos, had transformed into a command center. Legal files, financial statements, and a growing collection of recorded conversations sat in organized piles. She no longer saw the room as a memorial to her past. It had become the staging ground for her future. In the weeks that followed, she moved through life with calculated precision. At family dinners, she allowed herself to be interrupted, smiled at insults, and nodded as they discussed her house as though she were already gone. Every word, every tone, she captured discreetly with her recorder. At night, she categorized them, labeling each with dates and context. Her family's betrayal was no longer rumor. It was evidence. She reached out to Charlotte Harrington, her oldest friend, once a formidable corporate attorney. Over martinis at the Ritz, Eleanor laid everything bare. Charlotte's expression shifted from concern to outrage to something far sharper: determination. They're maneuvering you toward a crisis point, Charlotte said, timed with your 80th birthday. Classic predatory behavior. Precisely, Eleanor answered, her voice low and steady. I've secured my defenses. Now I need a social strategy. Charlotte's eyes gleamed. The court of public opinion, my favorite battlefield. Together they began drafting a plan. Charity galas, cultural events, luncheons. Eleanor would step back into Boston society, not as a fragile relic, but as the respected professor and strategist she had always been. Catherine and Victoria had tried to isolate her. Now she would remind the city who she was. That night, back in her Beacon Hill home, she opened the velvet box containing the sapphire brooch. The gems glittered in the lamplight, reflecting both beauty and weight. Beside it, the silver watch ticked with unwavering rhythm. She touched them both, her fingers steady. "They believe they've hidden me behind a column," she whispered. "But I am still the pillar." The watch ticked on, each second carrying her closer to the reckoning she had begun. They thought they had written her role for good. The quiet grandmother, smiling on cue, funding their fantasies, fading into the margins. But Eleanor Whitmore had stepped back into the light, and the game had only just begun. She entered Boston society again as if she had never left. The first appearance was deliberate, a charity tea for Boston Children's Hospital. Eleanor arrived in a tailored blue suit, her posture impeccable, her gaze clear. Gone were the pastel dresses Catherine had insisted were age-appropriate. This was Eleanor as she truly was, sharp, elegant, unmistakably present. Whispers followed her as she moved across the room. Old colleagues from Harvard greeted her warmly, surprised at her reemergence. "Professor Whitmore," one woman said with delight, "it's been far too long. We've missed your voice at these events." "I've been preoccupied with family matters," Eleanor replied smoothly. "My granddaughter is being married soon at the Fairmont, quite the extravagant affair." She paused just long enough, then added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Though strangely, they've placed me behind a column for the ceremony." Curious, isn't it? Eyebrows lifted. A murmur spread like a slow ripple through the room. Seeds planted with precision. By the time Eleanor left, she had reestablished herself with a dozen influential acquaintances and arranged several lunches for the coming weeks. Catherine and Victoria had tried to make her invisible. Now Eleanor was making herself unforgettable. The next battlefront came at the florist's shop. Eleanor had arranged to finalize the wedding flowers herself. Grace Holloway, the owner, greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Whitmore, it's such an honor to prepare arrangements for your family." They were midway through discussing lilies and roses when Catherine and Victoria swept in, surprise flashing across their faces. "Mother," Catherine said quickly, kissing Eleanor's cheek with perfunctory affection, "you didn't need to trouble yourself. We had it handled." "I'm perfectly capable of discussing flowers," Eleanor replied pleasantly. "Grace and I were just reviewing the details." "Details?" Victoria's tone sharpened, her eyes narrowing. "Payment structures, delivery schedules, business matters," Eleanor answered lightly, as if discussing the weather. They drifted away to inspect ribbon samples, whispering in low voices that carried just enough to reach Eleanor's ears. "You'll need to confirm everything with me," Catherine murmured to Grace. "My mother's memory isn't what it was." "She gets confused," Victoria added, her voice cool. "We're just helping her manage her finances." Grace's eyes flicked toward Eleanor, troubled, but her professional smile never faltered. When the younger women moved farther away, Grace leaned closer. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you ever need a witness to your clarity, your capability, I'd be honored. My own grandmother went through something similar." Eleanor reached out, squeezing her hand gently. "Thank you, Grace. That means more than you know." That evening, another unexpected ally appeared. Drew arrived at Eleanor's Beacon Hill home under the pretense of discussing a wedding detail. He seemed uneasy, as though he were carrying more than floral arrangements. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began once they were seated in her study, "I wanted to check that you're comfortable with everything. Sometimes Victoria gets carried away." Eleanor studied him carefully. He was earnest, perhaps naive, but not blind. "How thoughtful of you, Drew. Tell me, what do you know about my seating at the reception?" Confusion crossed his face. "Your seating? I assumed you'd be at the family table with us." "Apparently not," she said, her tone cool. "There's a lovely marble column with my name on it." His face flushed with shock. "That can't be right. I'll speak to Victoria immediately." Before he could rise, Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. "Consider carefully. Think about what that conversation might reveal about the woman you're planning to marry." Drew swallowed hard, his expression conflicted. "You're nothing like they describe you." "No," Eleanor said softly, her gaze steady. "I'm not." When he left, Eleanor returned to her desk, surveying the fortress she had built. Legal protections in place, medical documentation secured, financial safeguards enacted, social reconnections made, and now potential allies emerging where she least expected. At night, she categorized recordings of Catherine and Victoria's dismissive remarks, their whispered plans, their open contempt. She didn't need a courtroom. She needed truth preserved in their own words. The recorder's red light blinked like a sentinel in the dark. She ran her fingers over George's pocket watch, its tick marking each second with relentless steadiness. Time was on her side, but she no longer needed to wait. 12 days remained before the wedding. 12 days before Catherine and Victoria believed their triumph would be sealed. Instead, it would be Eleanor's moment. She lifted the sapphire brooch from its velvet box, turning it so the lamplight caught the deep blue stone. It had been worn by 5 generations of Whitmore brides, passed down as a symbol of strength and endurance. Victoria expected it as her birthright. Eleanor intended it as a lesson. Not yet, she thought. Not until you understand what legacy truly means. As she placed the brooch back into its box, Eleanor allowed herself the faintest smile. The board was set. The pieces moved as she intended. They had believed her irrelevant. They were about to discover how dangerous it is to underestimate Eleanor Whitmore. And if you've ever seen someone rise from dismissal to dominance, keep listening. The next move will take your breath away. Eleanor Whitmore moved through the days with deliberate calm, her outward demeanor unchanged, while inside every step tightened the web she had spun. Each morning began with tea in the sunlit parlor, where Catherine and Victoria believed she sat idly reminiscing. In truth, Elena reviewed contracts, checked bank transfers, and adjusted her calendar with precision. The facade of docility remained intact, while behind it her strategy sharpened. The wedding vendors became her silent allies. At the Fairmont Hotel, she sat with the manager in a private office overlooking Copley Square. Her tone was pleasant, her smile gracious, but her words carried the firmness of command. "I want to confirm the payment schedule," she said. "Deposits already placed, final balances due at 5 o'clock on the evening of the wedding. If I do not personally approve, they are canceled immediately." The manager hesitated, smoothing his tie. "It is unusual, Mrs. Whitmore." "Unusual," she agreed, "but binding. I trust the Fairmont values clarity as much as tradition." He nodded, scribbling notes. By the time Eleanor left, the contracts bore her stipulations in black ink, no loopholes left unattended. At the florist, she lingered among white lilies and pale roses as Grace Holloway recorded final delivery instructions. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she signed the amended agreement, her eyes flicking up to Eleanor's. "You're certain this is what you want?" "Quite certain," Eleanor answered softly. "Appearances can be deceiving, Grace. Let them see one thing while I prepare another." From the florist, she moved to the orchestra's rehearsal hall, where she listened as violins soared and trumpets rose. "Beautiful," she told the conductor, clapping lightly. "I'll be paying in full the morning after the event. Should anything unexpected occur, the contract allows for cancellation." The conductor raised an eyebrow, curiosity in his gaze, but nodded without protest. One by one, she visited every vendor, the caterer, the photographer, the jeweler preparing custom favors. Each received the same treatment. Each left with contracts that appeared ordinary, but carried quiet clauses that only Eleanor controlled. The illusion of generosity remained intact, but the power had shifted. At night, she returned to her study, where the recorder blinked beside her files. She listened again to Catherine's dismissive tones, Victoria's sharp whispers, their laughter at her supposed frailty. She labeled and stored each file, evidence organized like trial exhibits. Their cruelty no longer stung, it fueled her resolve. The sapphire brooch rested in its velvet box on her desk. Beside it, George's pocket watch ticked steadily, the rhythm as constant as her heartbeat. She touched them both before switching off the lamp, whispering, "Time is nearly up." A week before the wedding, Catherine and Victoria accompanied her to the Fairmont for the final walkthrough. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the air scented faintly with lilies and wax polish. Eleanor followed quietly as Victoria swept her arm toward the altar, describing the grandeur she expected. "Just imagine, Drew will be waiting for me here," Victoria said, her voice filled with practiced joy. "And the photographs from this angle. Stunning." Eleanor trailed a step behind, her gaze calm, her silence misinterpreted as docility. When they reached the reception hall, Catherine gestured toward the seating chart pinned to a corkboard. Here's where everyone will be. Family table in the center, close to the dance floor. Mother, you'll be... She hesitated slightly, then pressed on. Here, near the musicians. Eleanor's eyes followed the line of Catherine's finger to the far corner of the room. A round table tucked discreetly behind a marble column, positioned so that her view of the dance floor would be obstructed. Victoria smiled brightly. It's quieter there, Grandma, more comfortable. Eleanor studied the spot in silence, her expression unreadable. She touched the pearls at her throat, then nodded. How thoughtful. Neither of them noticed the faint tightening around her eyes, nor the way her fingers brushed her handbag where the recorder rested. On the ride home, Catherine chattered about floral arches, Victoria about the grandeur of her gown. Eleanor responded with polite murmurs, her gaze fixed on the city beyond the window. Each street light flicked across her face like a metronome, counting down the days. That night, she sat in her study and played back the recording from the walkthrough. Their voices, so self-assured, filled the room. She pressed the stop button, the silence that followed more powerful than any outburst. The web was fully drawn, contracts secured, allies discreetly won, evidence cataloged, and a plan that depended on nothing but her own resolve. Her family thought her passive, tucked behind their column of choice. They did not see the truth, that she had built the column herself, and soon she would tear it down stone by stone. The pocket watch ticked in the dark, each second resonant with promise. Soon, the night they celebrated, Eleanor Whitmore vanished, and with her disappearance, everything they had built upon her name began to unravel. The Fairmont Hotel glittered with candlelight, its grand ballroom alive with music, laughter, and the perfume of roses. Guests swirled across the marble floor, champagne glasses catching the gleam of chandeliers. Victoria Hastings floated in her satin gown, radiant with triumph. Catherine hovered nearby, pride and calculation mingled in her smile. They believed tonight marked their victory. Eleanor's legacy transferred, her influence finally silenced. But at the far edge of the room, behind the marble column, Eleanor sat quietly in her navy dress, her hands folded over her lap. She smiled faintly as the orchestra swelled. No one noticed that she rose from her chair 15 minutes before the first toast. No one watched as she slipped down the side corridor, her footsteps steady, her expression serene. By the time Victoria and Drew cut the cake, Eleanor's car was already weaving through Boston streets. At Logan Airport, a driver carried her single suitcase to the counter. The ticket had been purchased weeks before under her own name. The flight was bound for Florence, Italy. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Eleanor lifted a glass of champagne poured by the attendant. Below her, the city lights dwindled to sparks. She did not look back. Meanwhile, the celebration below began to fracture. At 8 o'clock p.m., the caterer approached Catherine with a tight smile. I'm afraid the payment authorization has failed. What? Catherine snapped, her smile freezing. Mrs. Whitmore arranged for balances to clear tonight. Without her approval, we cannot proceed with the main course. Confusion turned to panic. Within minutes, the florist delivered similar news. Final payment canceled. The orchestra, mid-rehearsed number, received a message from their manager. Funds had not been released. The photographer hesitated, his lens lowering, uncertain if he should continue. Catherine's face drained of color. Victoria hissed, "Fix it!" loud enough that guests began to turn. Drew's brow furrowed as he stepped back from the spectacle, his gaze sharpening with suspicion. The column where Eleanor had been seated remained empty. Some guests whispered, "Where is Mrs. Whitmore?" Others exchanged glances, murmuring about unpaid vendors and unraveling plans. The grandeur of the evening dissolved, replaced by a growing undercurrent of scandal. In the first-class cabin high above the Atlantic, Eleanor opened her handbag and withdrew George's silver pocket watch. Its steady tick was almost drowned out by the hum of the engines. She set it on the tray beside her champagne glass, the sapphire brooch glittering faintly at her throat. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to exhale. The plan was in motion. Every humiliation, every insult, every quiet dismissal, they had all led to this moment. The pocket watch ticked on, marking not only the passage of time, but the unveiling of truth. Back at the Fairmont, chaos spread. The cake sat untouched. The flowers wilted in their vases as angry vendors whispered about lawsuits. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some leaving early, others lingering to watch Catherine and Victoria scramble. Society's whispers sharpened into knives. The Whitmore family, once unassailable, had been humiliated on the very night meant to crown them. Drew approached Catherine, his voice low but edged with steel. "Did you know about this?" "Of course not," she snapped. "Mother must be confused. She doesn't understand what she's done." But her words rang hollow. Drew had seen the contracts. He had heard Eleanor speak with clarity. The lie collapsed even before the night was over. Victoria, her face flushed with fury, hissed at her mother. "Where is she?" No one could answer. Eleanor Whitmore was already hours away, the Atlantic stretching wide between them. On the plane, she closed her eyes as the steward dimmed the cabin lights. For the first time in years, she felt no weight pressing down, no voice silencing her stories, no dismissive hand waving her into shadows. She had orchestrated this moment with precision, and now she allowed herself to rest. The reckoning had only begun. And if you have ever dreamed of the day when those who underestimated you would finally see the truth, keep listening. Eleanor's revenge is only getting started, and what comes next will change everything. The Tuscan sun spilled across the terracotta rooftops of Florence as Eleanor Whitmore stepped onto the balcony of her hotel suite. The air carried the fragrance of jasmine and espresso, a world away from the chaos unraveling in Boston. She sipped her morning coffee slowly, savoring both the taste and the freedom. The pocket watch rested on the table beside her, ticking steadily as if to remind her that time now belonged entirely to her. Her phone buzzed with messages. She had expected them. Catherine's frantic voicemails arrived first, her tone shifting from outrage to pleading. "Mother, the vendors are threatening lawsuits. Guests are talking. You've embarrassed us beyond repair. Please call me back immediately." Eleanor listened once, then deleted them without reply. Next came Victoria's voice, high-pitched with fury. "How could you do this to me? To my wedding? Everyone is laughing at us. You've ruined everything, and I will never forgive you." Eleanor smiled faintly, her gaze sweeping across the Arno River, glinting in the distance. "Not everything," she whispered. "Only your illusions." She scrolled further. Among the messages was one from Drew, careful and deliberate. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know the full truth, but I believe you had your reasons. Please know I respect you." His words warmed her more than the morning sun. In the wreckage of betrayal, at least one voice had chosen to see her clearly. By the third day abroad, Boston society had begun to hum with scandal. Letters arrived at Catherine's Beacon Hill home, hand-delivered by courier. Each envelope bore Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. Inside, Catherine found transcripts, verbatim accounts of conversations she and Victoria had believed private. Their laughter, their schemes, their insults about Eleanor's supposed decline, all carefully dated and documented. The shock on Catherine's face was said to have been pale as marble. Victoria, upon reading her own words aloud, had flung the pages across the parlor, her cheeks burning crimson. The evidence was undeniable. Their betrayal was no longer whispered suspicion. It was a matter of record. Another letter had been delivered directly to Drew. Enclosed within was a personal note from Eleanor. "You deserve honesty before you bind yourself to our family. What you choose to do with it is your decision. But remember, respect is the foundation of every enduring union." Beneath the note was a small dossier of Victoria's lies, her manipulation of Eleanor, her calculated cruelty, even her plan to feign grief while securing control of the Whitmore estate. Drew read each page in silence, then folded the dossier with deliberate care. He did not confront Victoria immediately, but his silence spoke louder than accusation. At charity luncheons and dinner parties across Boston, whispers swirled. "Did you hear? Eleanor Whitmore's own daughter tried to sideline her. Imagine placing her behind a column at her granddaughter's wedding. Unthinkable. Eleanor deserves better." The tide of opinion shifted swiftly. Eleanor, far from diminished, became a figure of admiration. Her quiet dignity contrasted sharply against her family's arrogance. The same society Catherine and Victoria had sought to impress now turned its gaze upon them with cold disdain. In Florence, Eleanor allowed herself the small indulgences she had once postponed: a walk through the Uffizi, an evening spent listening to a string quartet, Afternoons wandering cobblestone streets with a gelato in hand. Each moment felt like a reclamation, not of youth, but of self. She was no longer hidden behind marble columns. She was seen, in her own eyes, in her own life. One evening she dined alone at a small trattoria. The waiter poured her a glass of Chianti, and as she lifted it, the pocket watch glinted under the candlelight. She thought of George, of the years they had built together, of the legacy they had intended to leave. A legacy not of wealth alone, but of integrity and resilience. Justice, she whispered to herself, raising the glass. At last. By the time she prepared to return to Boston, 3 weeks had passed. The scandal had not subsided. Instead, it had deepened. Catherine avoided society events altogether, while Victoria faced whispers even at her favorite boutiques. Drew, though still formally engaged, spent less and less time in her company. From her Florence balcony, Eleanor watched the sun sink behind the hills, her heart steady, her purpose renewed. She had not simply punished them, she had restored herself. The reckoning was complete, but the story was not yet finished. The sapphire brooch lay in her jewelry case, polished, waiting. Soon she would decide what to do with it, not as a token of tradition, but as a lesson, a symbol that legacy was not granted by entitlement. It was earned. The pocket watch ticked on, carrying her homeward, carrying her toward the final confrontation. The autumn air in Boston was crisp, carrying with it the scent of burning leaves and salt from the harbor. Eleanor Whitmore stepped out of the car in front of her Beacon Hill home, her heels striking the pavement with a rhythm that announced her return. The weeks in Florence had renewed her, but this moment, this homecoming, was the true culmination of her journey. The dining room had been prepared at her request. The table gleamed, set with crystal glasses and silver polished until it shone. Catherine sat stiffly at one end, her face pale, her hands restless in her lap. Victoria, her pride diminished but not yet extinguished, fiddled with the clasp of her pearl bracelet. Drew sat beside her, his expression steady, his gaze unreadable. Eleanor entered with quiet authority. The sapphire brooch glittered at her collar, the pocket watch concealed in her hand, its steady tick grounding her resolve. She took her seat at the head of the table, the place she had always occupied, the place that had nearly been stolen. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice calm but resonant. "We have matters to resolve." Catherine shifted. "Mother, we didn't intend—" Eleanor raised a hand, silencing her. "You did intend. The evidence is irrefutable. Your words, your laughter, your schemes. I do not require apologies. I require acknowledgement." The room fell still. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Drew glanced at her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "The Whitmore legacy is not a sum of money to be stolen, nor a house to be seized. It is integrity, it is resilience, and it will not be tarnished by greed." Catherine's eyes glistened. "We were afraid of losing control." "You lost it the moment you dismissed me," Eleanor said, her tone firm but not cruel. "From this day forward, the terms of this family are mine to set." She opened a leather folder and laid it on the table. Inside were documents outlining a new foundation in her name, the Whitmore Trust for Women in Leadership. Funds that Catherine and Victoria had once coveted would now be dedicated to scholarships, mentorships, and community programs. "This," Eleanor said, sliding the papers toward them, "is where our legacy will live." Victoria's lips parted in protest, but Eleanor continued before she could speak. "You will have roles within the foundation. Real work, not titles for vanity. You will learn the meaning of responsibility. Should you fail, you will be removed. The trust is no longer yours to manipulate." Drew leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady on Eleanor. "That's extraordinary." His voice carried admiration, a quiet acknowledgement that he understood her far more than Victoria ever had. Eleanor turned to her granddaughter, her eyes softening just enough to pierce the armor of entitlement. She opened a small velvet box, revealing the sapphire brooch. Gasps broke the silence as she held it up, the gem catching the candlelight. "This brooch has passed through 5 generations of Whitmore brides," she said. "It has never been a prize, Victoria. It is a test, a symbol of strength. You will wear it only if you prove worthy of carrying our name with honor." Victoria swallowed hard, her cheeks flushed. The arrogance that once defined her had dulled, replaced by something closer to humility, or at least the beginning of it. Silence lingered, thick with reckoning. Then Eleanor closed the box and set it down before her granddaughter. "Earn it," she said simply. The dinner that followed was subdued, each clink of silver against porcelain echoing with unspoken truths. Eleanor did not need to raise her voice. Authority radiated from her presence, from the weight of the pocket watch ticking softly in her palm. Weeks passed. The foundation launched with a flourish, its first gala drawing praise across the city. Catherine attended dutifully, her voice softer, her ambition redirected into committee work. Victoria appeared at the office daily, not in gowns but in simple blouses, learning grant applications, answering phones, listening for the first time in her life. Drew remained at her side, patient but watchful, his faith in Eleanor evident. Eleanor often sat in her office, overlooking the Charles River, the pocket watch on her desk, the brooch locked away until its lesson was complete. Students and young women came to her for guidance or guidance, drawn by her reputation, inspired by her resilience. She mentored them with the same precision she had once offered to diplomats, her voice steady, her wisdom hard-earned. One evening, as the city lights shimmered across the river, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. They had tried to hide her behind a column. They had tried to erase her voice, her influence, her very presence. Instead, she had risen stronger, reclaiming not only her dignity, but the future of her family name. Eleanor Whitmore was no relic. She was the pillar.